بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. So I will be presenting, of course, the Shi'i perspective on this issue, and again my emphasis is as an academic on this subject. This is how I present it in academic conferences. Where we talk about these things in a dispassionate way, not in an emotional or polemical way. That's just, that's my preamble here. So I'm going to present what the Shi'i sources indicate, what we can find in the Shi'i sources, to a certain extent in the Sunni sources as well, that are used by Shi'i scholars, and then some kind of general conclusions as well, inshallah. So first of all, there's a quote here by Marshall Hodgson. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically what Marshall Hodgson says, the famous historian, is that the events that occurred after the death of the Prophet were as important as the events during the life of the Prophet himself. Because Muslims ended up basically constructing their frames of reference or interpreting the past through what happened after the death of the Prophet. So there's a whole history of symbolism that's derived from the events and leading personalities and what they did or did not do after the death of the Prophet, right? And I think this is a very profound statement by Hodgson in The Venture of Islam, in talking about how the events following the generation after the Prophet were almost as formative as those of the Prophet's own time himself. And I think that's kind of a preamble to what I'm trying to get at here. So the first question is, did the event of the door happen? Really, who knows historically whether something happened or not? It depends how we can determine that using certain, what yields certainty. There are a lot of reports, as the previous, as Samat al-Sheikh mentioned before me. There's about 339 reports indicating this, 251 from Shia sources, 88 from Sunni sources. And there's entire encyclopedias written on this subject, detailing the isnads, discussing which isnads are weak, which isnads are sahih, which isnads are mu'tabar. It's a lot of work. There's, like I said, about 340 different reports scattered throughout the various books of ahadith through the centuries. There's a couple of important works I've listed there on that subject from the Shi'i perspective. Of course, they are polemical in nature, naturally. They're not written in an academic fashion. They're polemical, but nevertheless, they basically collect everything into these encyclopedic works of sorts. The one by Subhani is, of course, shorter. And my objective is just to provide a kind of snapshot of some of the Shi'i sources on the subject and how Shi'is how Shi'i ulama, such as the vast majority of them, I would say 99% of the Shi'i scholars approach this subject, at least as far as I know. And people like Sayyid Muhammad Hussein al-Jalali, Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Jalali, Sayyid Mahdi al-Khurasan, Sayyid Ja'far Murtada al-Amali, Sayyid Murtada al-Askari. These are all the great historians, the great muhaddithin, muhaqqiqeen, mudaqqiqeen, and how they kind of approach this subject. People like Sayyid Ahmad Husseini al-Ishqwari and others, and on and on. So one of the sources that is often used, of course, is Ibn al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili, which of course can be debated, but for Shi'is it's often used as a source. I'm not assuming that Sunnis accept it as a source. I'm saying this is what Shi'is tend to use as a source, where there is a letter exchange between Muawiyah and Amir al-Mu'mineen, in which basically, I'm not going to read the Arabic there, but basically it stated that, Ali, you were dragged like a camel. And it's quite brazen for Muawiyah to write this, if he actually wrote it. But nevertheless, this is what is imagined, at least, by people who report this and record it, that Ali was dragged, right? Kama yusaqu al-fahl al-makhshush. And this kind of sets the context of something that occurred at his home after Saqifa, and then Ali responding to him that, that there's no shame in being madloom. There's no shame in being oppressed that this happened to me, and so on and so forth. And this kind of sets the context. And then, in a more general sense, we come to numerous sources. Again, these tend to be used by Shi'is. Again, it doesn't mean that it's authenticated by our brothers of Ahlul Sunnah, but this is the Shi'i perspective, and that's what I'm presenting here. I'm not necessarily claiming this is the Sunni perspective. And then, there is Abu Ubayd Qasim al-Salam, right, in his Kitab al-Amwal. He predated al-Bukhari, who talks about the final moments of Abu Bakr's life. And where he says that I regretted three things. And then he says, وَلَمْ أَكُنْ فَعَلْتُ كَذَا وَكَذَا. And we find this censorship, this kada wa kada, put into numerous reports, such as the report by Mas'udi, to a certain extent has this as well, where other reports finish the discussion. So it will be very interesting to see how this discussion finishes. So Tabari narrates with his isnad, that the visit of Abdurrahman ibn Auf to see Abu Bakr, he reports, وَأَمَّا ثَلَاثَ وَدَدْتُ أَنِّي تَرَكْتُهُنَّ فَوَدَدْتُ أَنِّي لَمْ أَكْشِفْ بَيْتْ فَاطِمَةَ عَنْ شَيْءٍ وَإِنْ كَانُوا قَدْ غَلَقُوهُ عَلَى الْحَرِّ. Right? That I wish that I had not unveiled or opened or thrown open the house of Fatima. And we see numerous sources such as the Mu'ajam of Tabarani, Mas'udi, and other people who narrate this. So it certainly, is a part of the early historical memory. It's something that is widely transmitted. It's in numerous sources that something happened. What happened exactly here? Something happened at that house. There was some altercation of some kind. At least when we look through numerous sources, one of them is Tabari, and as I said, of course, Abu Ubayd Qasim al-Salam mentions something and he says kada wa kada. And Khalid Yahya Blankenship, the famous scholar in the United States at Temple, he mentioned something very interesting in his footnote to Tabari here. He says that there's something that is being concealed from the reader, and which he regards as the event of throwing open the house of Fatima. Of course, Khalid Yahya Blankenship is a well-known scholar, a non-Shi'i scholar, but nevertheless, he's an academic, so I'm not going to approach it as being Shi'i or Sunni. He's an academic scholar, and he mentions that there is definitely more that meets the eye here in early Islamic history. And then we see similar references in Ibn Abd al-Rabi al-Farid or Tabarani's Mu'jam al-Kabir, and I put that down there. So something happened here per se. Muruj al-Dhahab of al-Mas'udi. Again, these are historical sources, and it's debated as to whether historiographical sources can be accepted. What is the nature of their i'tibar? What is the nature of their hujjiyah? And I'm not going to necessarily get into that here because I'm not kind of approaching it from that perspective. My perspective is to say that the historical memory contains it. And these become sources in early sources by prominent scholars or historians, who are not necessarily muhaddithin, but they're at least historians of the early period who are writing. Some of them were writing under Abbasi patronage, some of them were not writing under Abbasi patronage. We talk about this. So, for example, Mas'udi's report says, right, وَدَدْتُ أَنِّي لَمْ أَكُنْ فَتَشْتُ بَيْتْ فَاطِمَةَ وَذَكَرَهَا فِي ذَلِكَ كَلَامًا كَثِيرًا. And much words were mentioned then, for example. So we see that there's different versions of this, but it's spread out over numerous sources. And Tabari tends to be the most explicit, as well as the Mu'ajam of Tabarani. So all of this kind of comes back to this issue following Saqifa, as Samahat al-Shaykh already mentioned, about the Ansab al-Ashraf of Baladuri, which, yes, I agree, the sanad is problematic. There is irsal in the sanad of the riwayah in Ansab al-Ashraf. There's a gap between the narrators. But nevertheless, from a kind of general historical perspective, being narrated by Al-Madaini, a very prominent historian, and of course Baladuri, there's debate as to whether, what kind of historian he was, whether he was, for example, Dhahabi, I believe, praises him, and others do not. But nevertheless, it's found in a very early source, in a source that contains a lot, it's a part of what I call the early historical memory. from the very early period of Islam. And so part of that historical memory, it's found itself there, right? And Shaykh already narrated it, that, you know, Abu Bakr comes to the door after finding out that they're not giving bay'ah, you know, and Umar ibn Khattab comes to the door, and, you know, and Fatima salamullahi alayha confronts him, and so on and so forth. And then he says, ذَلِكَ أَقْوَى فِي مَا جَاءَ بِهِ أَبُوكَ, right? And this is basically the strongest of what your father has brought. Where, you know, Umar ibn Khattab is looking out for the ummah. He's seeing that there's dissension occurring in the ummah. There are people not giving, you know, allegiance, you know, and this is becoming a problem. And we see similar reports in Al-Sayyuti Muslim Fatima, Ibn Abd al-Barr al-Isti'ab, the Kitab al-Saqifa of Ibn Abil, as transmitted in Sharh Nahj al-Balagha, I believe Abu Bakr al-Jawhari, and other sources as well. So this is just a selection of some of the sources that describe this event. And then, of course, we already talked about the sanad, and as I do recognize, it is mursal, and there is irsal. So it depends again on our epistemological position on these issues as to whether a lot of marasil can amount to something or not. That's a different story. But it's an interesting discussion, and we can definitely have epistemological differences on this issue, and Shaykh has pointed that out very well, of course. And then there's a Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, volume 7, 572, Dar al-Fikr, where we find a similar, right, where Umar ibn Khattab says, Inna amartuhum an yuhraqa alayhim al-bayt, right, where again, this whole issue that there's a confrontation after Saqifa, comes to the house, there's something occurs here, you know, and there's at least a threat to burn down the home, as narrated by Ibn Abi Shayba, who died in 235 Hijrah, of course, a very, very early hadith. Muhammad bin Bishr, narrating from Ubaydullah bin Umar, from Zayd bin Aslam, from his father. And then it says, when Abu Bakr was pledged allegiance, it reached him that a group had gathered in the house of Ali. So these are some of the sources. Now, so we could perhaps say that the Sunni sources are very general, are ambiguous, kind of leave this thing open. It can be debated whether this happened from a Sunni viewpoint or not. Perhaps it can be. I mean, it's not for me to speak on, you know, about what our brothers believe or not. Nevertheless, there's numerous sources, as I said, about 88 different narrations that indicate that some kind of conflict, something of some controversial nature occurred between the two of them, between Umar and Fatima, or between Umar ibn Khattab, Abu Bakr, and Fatima and or Zubayr as well, as we know. As for the Shia sources, there are many. There are about 250 or so, or 200, I don't remember, but over 200 sources in this regard, with multiple isnads, multiple different isnads. I would have to humbly disagree with Sayyid Muhammad bin Fadlallah on this issue. I don't think he did an in-depth research on this. He only had one small book on Fatima Zahra, it's about 50 pages that he had written. He hadn't really conducted a complete research. Even when I spoke to some of his students, he said that towards the end of his life, even when he was writing Al-Zahra and Qudwa, he mentions at the end there that she was no doubt madluma, and he describes what had happened to her and all of these things like this. So, you know, Sayyid Muhammad bin Fadlallah, with all due respect to him, al-marhum, rahimahullah, is one among, let's say, 100. So there's 99 that have done our research, have put together encyclopedias, and Sayyid Fadlallah, who believes something different, with all due respect to him. You know, may Allah raise his rank in Jannah, inshallah. So there are numerous sources. Al-Kafi, Kamil al-Ziyarat, Al-Ikhtisas, Al-Amali, Kitab al-Jamal, Al-Mufid, Al-Imam, Tafsir al-Ayash. This is just a sampling of them. The seventh Imam Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim describes Fatima as a Shahida, as a female, right? Sadiqa Shahida in Al-Kafi. Shaykh Tusi in Talkhis al-Shafi says, مما أنكر عليه ضربهم لفاطمة عليهم السلام قد روي أنهم ضربوها بالصياد والمشهور الذي لا خلاف فيه بين الشيعة. That there's no dissension among the Shia on this issue. أن عمر ضرب على بطنها حتى سقطت أو حتى أسقطت وسمي السقط محسنا. Right? That, you know, Tusi says that there's no difference between us on this issue, on this, of course, very controversial issue of Omar, the violent altercation between them. Of course, we have the riwayat and kamil ziyarat. This is again just a sample here. It is musnad. It has a, it is musnad and at least mu'tabar, if not sahiha, according to most. Going back to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, in which the Prophet goes for the night journey, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs the Prophet of what will happen after him. Now, of course, this might not, of course, we have to understand, within a Shi'i epistemic space, this is all very well possible. This is being narrated from a Ma'asum Imam. So we have to step back and see, look, from the Shi'i perspective, this is being narrated with this musnad to Imam al-Sadiq. And, and it's narrated in a very early source, and it's one among many other traditions like it, to a certain extent, which kind of describe her being hit while pregnant, and وَلَا تَجِدُ مَانِعًا, and she'll be attacked, and so on and so forth. Although it doesn't mention who does the attack, okay? But it does mention that an attack takes place. And what is in her womb will be damaged. مِنَ الضَّرْبِ وَتَمُوتُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ الضَّرْبِ, right? And then the Prophet says, إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Again, from within a Shi'i universe, this is all possible, okay? Because of a notion of cosmic suffering, the downtroddenness, all of these notions are very pronounced within Shi'i thought. We come to al-ikhtisas again, which is now takes a different spin on this. Perhaps that's why
5 minutes, Shaykh Vinay. 5 minutes.
Abdul Zahra Mahdi says that there could have been even multiple attacks, according to some of the Shi'i sources, where Abdullah bin Sinan reports it's musnad to Imam al-Sadiq. Now, al-ikhtisas is debated whether Mufid was a muhaddith or Musa ibn Imran. Musa ibn Imran, of course, was a very early muhaddith, who was contemporary to Mufid, so it doesn't really matter whether it was Mufid or Musa ibn Imran. Right? He kicked her and he slapped her, and Imam al-Sadiq says, it is as if I could see her earring coming off her ear when she was smacked. This is narrated by Shaykh al-Mufid in his work. From Abdullah bin Sinan with the sanad is musnad to Imam al-Sadiq. It's completely musnad to Imam al-Sadiq. And then Dalal al-Imam of Ibn Rustam al-Tabari. Again, there's numerous asanid, numerous Shia sources in this regard. This is narrated from his Shaykh Ibn Harun al-Akbari, who is without doubt accepted by the Shi'i scholars as being someone of a man of great repute. In fact, he narrated most of the usul and the musannafat from the time of the Imams. And he narrates it with his sanad, going back to the Imam, which talks about, now puts a kind of different spin on this and talks about kunfut. But nevertheless, putting it all together, something, at least in the Shi'i universe, happened here, where Omar himself struck Fatima with the sheath of his sword after kunfut. He came and left. And we see similar sources to this effect. As I said, this is just a sample here. And there's the isnad from Harun ibn Musa al-Akbari, قال حدثني أبي, of course his father, وحدثني أبو علي محمد بن حمام بن سهيل رضي الله عنه, قال وروى أحمد بن محمد البرقي, of course the famous writer of Kitab al-Muhassin, and Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Ash'ari al-Qumi, again another very famous muhaddith of the Shia sources, from the Shia perspective, of course, not from the Sunni perspective, from the Shia perspective. These are the doctors of Shiism here, narrating this. These are very famous muhaddithin, who've narrated hundreds, if not thousands, of ahadith. From Abdullah ibn Sinan, and Ibn Miskan, and Abi Basir, and Abi Abdullah, again all prominent companions of the sixth Imam, describing وَكَانَ سَبَبُ وَفَاتِهَا, and he talks about it here, right? وَلَقَزَهَا بِنَعْلِ السَّيْفِ. And then, so my point is that there's tons of sources, there's volumes of sources outside of Sulaim, leaving Sulaim aside, within the Shi'i school of thought, which have multiple isnads, different isnads, narrated by different mashayikh, with different turuq, of different kinds. And then the Ismaili sources is a different thing altogether. The Ismaili sources, Qadi Noman narrates this, other people within the Ismaili circles narrate it with their own turuq, with separate turuq and their own different works as well. And so it would seem among Shi'is, this was something that was commonly accepted and narrated through multiple generations with different isnads and different riwayat. Now, as for Ali's silence, the general Shi'i answer comes back to Ali's, the incumbents, your likeness is that of the Kaaba, people come to it and it does not come to you. Alayka as-sabr, right? Upon you is sabr as to what shall befall you. Now, for many people, even like Mahmoud Ayub, this makes no sense. The historian says this really makes no sense. But again, when viewed within a Shi'i universe, it makes sense. This is how Shi'is, many Shi'is, most Shi'is, large proportion of Shi'i scholars understand these issues. Of course, this riwayah is from Sayyid al-Radi, who narrates it in his Qasas al-A'imma, with his musnad to Imam al-Qadim, who he happened to descend from. Who's narrating this conversation between the Prophet and Ali, where he says, "Alayka bis-sabr, Ali ma yanzilu bika wa biha hatta taqaddamu alayhi." Right, and there's the idea that it was not for Ali to fight back, to take retribution, for nothing of Islam would be left. And then we see a similar riwayah in Al-Ikhtisas, where he says, "Taraktu haqqi makhafatan iqtidad an-nas." Right? And then we see another interesting discussion between Imam al-Hasan and some of the companions of Muawiyah, where this issue of the attack on his mother comes up again, narrated through Abdullah bin Ja'far al-Himyari, actually. In al-Ihtijaj, but it is musnad, because Ihtijaj tends to be mursal, but this one is interestingly musnad. It's a very interesting report. It was a discussion between Imam al-Hasan and some of the companions of Muawiyah, where he basically curses them and says, one of you, were present when my mother was attacked. And again, so I mean, it's from, again, within the Shi'i universe, this is very very common. I'll just end here. What exactly transpired, we can't be certain. The Sunni sources tend to leave this rather ambiguous. There was Saqifa, some kind of disagreement occurred after Saqifa. The intensity and the nature of it, Allahu A'lam. Something happened. Something of some sort happened. At least enough for Abu Bakr to regret it, if those riwayat are accepted. Again, within a Shi'i universe, if those traditions are accepted. And again, the Shi'i sources outside of Sulaim are replete with references in this regard. So thus, it would seem, for Shi'i scholars, it would seem implausible to actually deny the whole event itself. And in this regard, Sayyid Fadlallah is an outlier, very much an outlier, with all the ma'kulli ihtiram.
Shukran jazeelan.
Okay, thank you.